Hello guys, this is Mr. Cole. Last video for the week. Hope everybody's doing all right. I miss you guys. Make sure we're all getting our work done and getting through this thing, okay? So with that, if you remember, in 1968 led to the election of Richard Nixon, a Republican, to take over kind of the crisis in Vietnam. Now with this, today we're going to talk about Nixon's decision making as president. And Nixon sees the ending half of the war, although it's a lot longer than people thought it would take. And then eventually we'll get into the legacy part. So um, when Nixon comes in, Nixon essentially, and rightfully kind of so, blames the Johnson administration for the entire crisis in Vietnam and for how caught up we are in it. So in 1969, Nixon's way of getting us out of Vietnam is what he called Vietnamization. This is going to be a gradual withdrawal of troops, okay? Not an immediate America's gone, but slowly turning the war over to the South Vietnamese army. So we're going to start taking troops out, but then start supplying more money, guns, and training to South Vietnam so that they can help themselves, right? And they can fight the war on their own. Okay? This is a super popular idea in America. Like, absolutely, let's start sending soldiers home. So you'll see as Nixon takes over, some soldiers come home, and we start giving more money to the South Vietnamese. However, it doesn't really totally make sense. As Nixon is saying he's doing this Vietnamization, Nixon actually starts increasing bombing and increasing the invasions in many locations in South Vietnam. For example, Nixon will order on his own, right? Not even like talking to his members of his cabinet, will order the invasion of Cambodia, a second country, because Cambodia was allowing the Viet Cong to be moving throughout the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So, in one hand, he's saying he's getting us out of the war, but on the other hand, he's actually increasing the war to new places like Cambodia. Along with this, Nixon starts increased bombings into the northern parts of Vietnam, just bombing towns and things like that. The idea was he was trying to basically show the North Vietnamese that he wasn't going to back down. So he's kind of doing a little bit of both. He's telling the American public, yes, we're leaving Vietnam, but then he's also increasing it at the same time. And he's trying to get North Vietnam to come to the negotiating table. Now, the problem for Nixon, and not all are his fault, is that there is just a string of just awful news all in a row about the war in Vietnam that's going to really affect life here at home. Obviously, his decision to invade Cambodia, kind of secretly decided to invade Cambodia, was very unpopular in the country. And with that, led to, actually, I'll move back here at the start, sorry. So with that, news comes out early in Nixon's presidency of actions that United States soldiers committed in the village of My Lai. My Lai was a Vietnamese village suspected of harboring Viet Cong soldiers. When the American soldiers got there, they found primarily women, children, and elderly men. They did not find many Viet Cong kind of aged men there. However, they were told by their commander, by their lieutenant, to kill all people in the village, including the women and children. And so with this, the images of the My Lai massacre that come out are just horrific and disgusting, of little babies and women and little children who were slaughtered by American soldiers. I mean, we're talking firing machine guns at them, throwing grenades at them, just horrific actions done by this army unit. And this all comes out. And as you can imagine, at home, there is so much anger. Now, this is not Nixon's fault. This actually happened before Nixon was even president. But obviously just stirs up even more resentment for the war. Okay? Along with this, with the decision to invade Cambodia, this is going to be very, very unpopular at home. By the decision to invade Cambodia, this is 1969, 1970. The war's already been going on for 5 years. Okay? To keep that in mind, World War II, we were only in for 4 years. Right? So we're already further along than we were even in World War II. And the war is just dragging on and on and on. And now it looks like Nixon's expanding it. So with this, the college protests spring up again. And most famously at Kent State University. At the college protests at Kent State, the Ohio governor called in. Kent State's just about 2 hours from us in Tiffin, over in the Akron area. And with that, the soldiers from the Ohio National Guard were called in. There is some debate or disagreement about who started some of the fighting of the students. It was the National Guard, who knows. But in total, 4 college students were killed by the Ohio National Guard shooting in their rifles into the crowd. Here is the famous photograph. This is the Pulitzer Prize-winning image of one of the young men that was murdered and killed as part of these protests. Now, the worst part is that 2 of the 4 who were killed were actually not even in the protesters. They were just on their way back home from class. Okay. Obviously, again, Kent State, Nixon did not do that, right? I mean, the Ohio National Guard is controlled by the Ohio governor. But again, of course, Nixon gets the blame for it. Okay. The other big scandal that comes out is an event called the Pentagon Papers. Okay. The Pentagon Papers is this enormous report that the government put together that basically walked through how we got into Vietnam. Nixon or Johnson, I remember, who had it ordered that, I want us to study how we got here, right? How did we get caught up in sending 500,000 troops and hundreds of billions of dollars to this small little country in Southeast Asia? So the Pentagon Papers was the Pentagon's our army. It's where the Army's and the Department of Defense is at, where they were studying basically the history of how we got here. And they were looking at top secret documents from presidents going all the way back to President Truman in the 1950s about how we got so connected to South Vietnam. And basically what the documents showed was that president after president after president had secretly been sending more and more troops and more aid to South Vietnam without telling the American people. It showed that all these presidents had been lying. Now, once again, this is not really Nixon's fault, okay? Most of the actual Pentagon Papers were really damaging for President Kennedy and President Johnson, and a little bit of President Eisenhower were really, really damning evidence that they were behind a lot of the secret buildup of the American military presence in Vietnam without telling us. Now, where Nixon gets kind of caught up in trouble with the Pentagon Papers is that Nixon decides to try to block them from being released. Okay, one of the workers who was working on the report made photocopies of all the documents and tried to give it to the New York Times. Okay, the New York Times tried to release it, but the Nixon administration came out and said it was illegal to release it because it was going to be dangerous to national security. So the case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, where eventually the Supreme Court will say, nope, that is allowed to be released. That's the freedom of speech, the First Amendment, the freedom of the press. And so as a result, the Pentagon Papers were released and showed all the presidents that had kind of been lying to the American people about what's really going on in Vietnam. In that, there's some Pentagon Papers, the one that stands out with me the most was from our generals. And it gave the reasons for why they were going to Vietnam, and it ranked it that 70% of why we went to Vietnam was just to maintain America's reputation as a world power. Right? The only 5% of the reason was to actually protect South Vietnam. Right? So they list all these reasons about, well, we want to look tough, we want to look strong on communism, we want to try and stick it to China and the Soviet Union. And we're sitting there, oh my gosh, we've lost 58,000 men just to hold our reputation. And it's very damning evidence against the war. Eventually, though, Nixon realizes that we have to start pulling troops out. And as the troops start pulling out, eventually in 1973, an agreement was made between North and South Vietnam for a ceasefire to end the war, the Vietnam War. Both sides meet in Paris. The agreement was that the United States would leave Vietnam, okay? The North and South would stop fighting each other, and the war would be over. This achieved what Richard Nixon calls a peace with honor. Idea that we got a peace, that when we left Vietnam, there was still North and there was still South Vietnam. And so we defended South Vietnam. We did what we meant to go over there and accomplish. And so Nixon claims that this is a success. Okay. Well, shortly after this peace with honor, Nixon is going to be removed from presidency, or he's going to resign from the presidency as a result of his own personal scandals. We'll get into that later on next week. But officially in 1973, America's longest war is over. Officially, the war was fought from 1965 to 1973. That at the time was the longest war in our country's history. That has since been beaten by the war in Afghanistan. But we'll get into that way later on. Okay. Now, the sad part, though, is that just because America left, and just because the ceasefire does not hold long. For only about 6 months after the ceasefire, to a year, the North Vietnam breaks the ceasefire. North Vietnam saw an opportunity. They saw that the South was still mismanaged, that the government in the South was not very strong, the army was not very strong, and so North once again invades the South. As South Vietnam asks America for more help, Americans, tired of the war, tired of the politics behind it, are just at this point completely against it. And so America sits on the sidelines as South Vietnam is taken over very, very quickly by North Vietnam. Eventually, as the North Vietnamese surround the capital of Saigon, the order came for all remaining American personnel and all those in the South Vietnamese government to escape in an evacuation, to escape the punishments that would come from the North Vietnamese. And so in 1975, April 1975, the code to evacuate was playing over the Armed Forces Network, White Christmas by Bing Crosby, the famous Christmas carol. That was the signal for all Americans to immediately get to the embassy to escape. And here is the famous airlifts from the embassy as helicopter after helicopter would pick up as many people as they could carry, as many Americans as they could carry, and evacuate them off into ships out in the ocean. With that, as helicopter after helicopter came, there was not enough room to land all of these helicopters on our ships. So as a result, they would drop the people off on the ship, and then they would go and actually push the ship off, or push the helicopter off of the ship and into the ocean. All this, of course, is caught on American television, and ultimately is the end of the Vietnam War. Shortly after, about 3 hours after the last helicopter left Vietnam, the North Vietnamese rolled in, and Vietnam was once again unified, as it still is today, under the communist government. Ultimately, although we left with a peace with honor, when we left, South Vietnam was still around. You could pretty much classify this as the first war that America lost, right? And that as we leave, and as our last helicopters leave Vietnam, Vietnam is now a communist country, and communism has spread. And with that, the Vietnam War is over. All right, guys, I know that was a long one. That's where we'll stop today. We'll talk about the legacy of the war next week. Start getting ready for a Vietnam War quiz coming up, okay? I'll see you guys.